So, my name is Matt Collins. Like I said, I'm not one of the pastors here anymore. But it kind of leads into what I want to talk to you about today. Transition is what I want to talk to you. I used to begin my talks by saying I was one of the pastors here. But God called me back into the profession of public education. About a year ago, I approached Drew and I said, Drew, I feel like God's calling me back into public teaching. And he said, that's great. Do you have a job? Nope. Have any been posted? Nope. So you're giving your notice about a job that doesn't exist yet? Yep. And things had worked out. A job got posted. I applied for it. I was fortunate enough to acquire a position. But one of the things that Drew said to me when I told him that this is where I feel like God's calling me was, we are never going to stand in the way of someone heeding to God's call in their life. And I felt without any confusion at all that God said, listen, I taught you what I needed you to learn as a youth pastor. Now I need you to go into the mission field. I need you to love on these kids. I need you to be immensely patient with these high schoolers and show them that I am an immensely patient, loving God who cares about them. I need to do this with your actions. And there was no confusion to me. And Drew said, whatever I can do, whatever Compass can do to help you out, we're going to do that. And it did two things. It helped me transition into what life would be like moving out of ministry and into public education again, even though it was a field I was in for 10 years, 7 years before that. But it also helped me realize what life is like when you're not a professional Christian, right? Like now I sit up here, and rather than being someone whose job it is to read the Bible and teach it, I'm a person just trying to get to know Jesus and get to understand what this whole relationship with Jesus thing is all about in the real world. Like when you have the demands of job and work and family and just life pressing down on you, and a significant portion of your life isn't necessarily work in the church, how's that work for you? How's that transition happen? And so last year when I talked to Drew, it set me at ease about my transition. Now, I didn't think about my transition much because typically we don't think about transition. One way to describe transition is that it's a road between two significant parts of life. That's kind of what a transition is. It's a road connecting two significant parts of your life. And that could be between an old job and a new job. It could be between being in the single life and being in the married life. That's a transition. It could be between being newlyweds or being new parents. It's quite a transition. It could be between being empty nesters and boomerang kids, or in my case, boomerang in-laws. My in-laws are snowbirds now. They live in Arizona, and they're here for the summer months. We love having them around. But it's kind of funny when someone talks about their boomerang kids, I said, hey, at least they're not boomerang in-laws. But transition is the road between two significant parts of life. Two parts of life you look at and you focus on, but oftentimes we don't focus on the transition itself. And I think that actually hurts the significance not just of the transition, but of those two major life events. We fail to look at the transition out of the old and into the new. We fail to look at the significance of that transition as we approach the new part of our life, the new thing of our life. And I think people struggle a lot of times in the transition because we don't focus on it. We don't look at it as a significant part of life. I've had a lot of transition in my life this past year. In the past year, I transitioned out of full-time ministry into full-time education, into football coach, into head track coach, into dean half-time, into my in-laws moving out and then moving back in again. It's been a year of significant transition. And in that time, what I've realized is all of those things are wonderful. What's also wonderful is the transition between them, the road between them. So today I want to talk about a little bit about that. And I want to start off sharing a story that happened roughly 8 years ago when my brother himself was on a rough road. He was on a rough patch of road between two significant portions of his life. My brother was separating from an estranged wife and divorcing from an estranged wife and looking to get engaged and remarried. And he called me up and talked about some of this rough road. And he knew I had come to faith. He knew I came to know Jesus. He knew I came to know who Jesus was and believed that he is who he says he is. And what that did for me is it commanded me, because I realized if this is what I believe, I need to live my life in a certain way. I need to live my life a little bit differently. I need to commit my entire life to Jesus and his way of doing things. Now, that's the best decision I've ever made. It's followed closely, by the way, with my decision to marry my wife, but it is the best decision I've ever made. Who actually brought me over to Oregon to figure out who Jesus was. So in a way, she's, not just in a way, but she is the significant portion of me figuring out who Jesus is. But my brother was going through a rough patch, and he knew this is where I was, and I was in transition, and my transition looked a lot different than his transition is. And he said, man, I'm a struggling believer. He's like, I gave my life to Christ now, but I struggle to believe. And I think at some point in our lives, every single one of us is a struggling believer. We see things and we struggle to believe it. We see things in the world and we struggle to connect them with the goodness of God. And that's a real struggle that all of us have at some point. And my brother, who was in this transition and had been in a transition years prior, said, I used to believe in Jesus wholeheartedly and follow him. And I remember that. I was in middle school, and I remember when he came to faith, and he brought me to Christian music festivals, and he did all these things, and then he fell away, and I never knew quite why he fell away. But in this conversation I had with my brother 8 years ago, and he passed away about 7 years ago, he told me that the reason he had fallen away is because in a previous transition, in a previous rocky road scenario, someone who was pretty formidable in his faith journey came up and said, I think in a helping way, but said, if your faith was stronger, you wouldn't be struggling like this. If your faith was stronger, you wouldn't be on this rocky road. And I remembered hearing that, being pretty early in my faith walk, being pretty early in my trying to figure out this whole Jesus thing, and think, man, that doesn't seem to go with everything I've heard about, everything I've read about. It doesn't seem to go right. And having become a follower and diving into the Bible and learning more about Jesus and getting to know Jesus himself personally, what I realize now is coming to faith actually might make the road rockier. Now, it's a great struggle. It's a healthy struggle, but it might make the road rockier. And so in talking to my brother, I said, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I think deep down inside, my brother knew that wasn't the case, but he had a tough time reconciling the God that this man introduced him to the God that this man said you need faith in and you won't hit a rocky road. And I think now that when you become a follower of Jesus and you realize that, you know what, one of my jobs as a follower of Jesus is to share the love of Jesus with people, your road's going to get rockier because Satan's going to see that you're a tool for God that's going to do powerful things. I think that's what happened to my brother. I came to know who Jesus was a little bit initially because of my brother's faith. And then he hit this rocky road and it tore his faith apart, and in doing so, tore me away from Jesus. Jesus still pursued me, which is why I'm sitting here in front of you now, talking about a faith my brother had. And he was a struggling believer, and I think we all go through that. And I think that's perfectly normal. And actually, I think that's perfectly normal because the Bible talks about John the Baptist, who's the cousin of Jesus, struggling in his faith a little bit as he's jailed for doing the right thing. And he actually sends a messenger to Jesus and says, are you really the Messiah we've been waiting for, or should we keep looking for someone else? Now, John the Baptist, by the way, not just was Jesus' cousin, probably saw him grow up a little bit, probably knew he was, God. But he also baptized Jesus and heard a voice from the heavens say, this is my son whom I love and I'm proud of. And he saw the Holy Spirit descend like a dove onto Jesus, and the Holy Spirit filled Jesus. He saw this and still struggled a little bit. Hey, struggling's normal. And I think sometimes when we downplay the road of transition, it can really knock us around if we don't focus on this road of transition isn't just something we need to go through, that's something that's great, but it's something that Jesus walks with us on. And so If Chris were alive today, I would talk to him about this. I would tell him that, you know what, rocky roads are perfectly natural. And not only that, but sometimes going from one great place in our life to another great place in our life goes through a hard place in our life. And that hard place might be a struggle, but it's a good struggle because it gets us to where Jesus wants us. And Jesus walks with us through it. And I think more often than not, we forget not only that that transition is necessary, but we forget that Jesus walks there with us. So today I wanted to share 2 road stories with you. 2 stories from the Bible that deal with roads where Jesus encounters people, and those people are going through hard times, those people are going through confusing times. One of them you'll see is actually on his way to do really bad things, and Jesus encounters him anyway. And so let me set the stage for the first part, and we'll dive right in. So this is at the end of the Gospel of Luke. Jesus had been arrested, he'd been tried, he'd been convicted wrongfully, and he'd been sentenced to death by crucifixion, which wasn't just a horrible way to die, but it was a message being sent from the Roman Empire that you don't mess with us. And so Jesus was hung on a cross and ultimately died, was brought down, he was buried. And actually, right before we hop into the story, he rose from the dead. And people saw that his tomb was empty, and a giant rock was moved out of the way of his tomb that was actually being guarded by Roman soldiers. 2 women went and they saw and they talked to an angel, and the angel was like, he's not here, he's risen, just like he said he would be. But when we hop into this story here, it's about the 2 disciples that are walking the 7-mile road to Emmaus. These 2 disciples were told what was going to happen. Jesus told them exactly what was going to happen. Jesus told them, hey, this is my body. He actually raised up some bread and said, this is my body. It's going to be broken for you, and it has to happen this way. But don't worry, this temple will be rebuilt in 3 days. 3 days after I die, I'm going to come back. And these disciples didn't quite understand it. Have you ever been told something really clearly but still didn't understand it? All the husbands right now are like, yeah. And the wives right now are like, yeah. Right? So, but that's what happened here. These disciples were told something very clearly. Jesus did not hide things. He didn't speak in code. He told them exactly what was going to happen. And when it happened, it still threw them for a loop. Hey, life can happen that way too. We can know things are going to happen, and when it does happen, it still throws us for a loop. So let's hop right in. It's going to be Luke chapter 24. It's somewhat of a long passage. You're more than welcome to follow along with me. You can follow along on the screen behind me here. It's going to come up. There it is. It's 13 to 32, and it's a tremendous story. It's actually one of my favorite in the Bible. Now, on the same day, 2 of them, same day is when Jesus was discovered not in his tomb anymore. That's this day. On the same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about a 7-mile journey from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. They're on a road and Jesus encounters them. They're walking along, discussing what happened, and Jesus encounters them. But they were kept from recognizing who Jesus was. You might not recognize when Jesus encounters you on your road. You might be walking along your road and someone encounters you and think, oh, that's nice. It might actually be Jesus, just like this. And Jesus doesn't let you recognize him right away. And he does that for a couple reasons, I believe. I think the biggest reason he does it, though, is because he wants to tell you something, and he wants you to believe it for its truth, not just simply because Jesus told you. Now, everything Jesus tells you is truth, but he wants you to understand the truth is truth. And I think here he's talking to these 2 people and wants them to understand something. And not simply because he's the Messiah that they've been talking about and following, but because it's also truth. So he asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked them, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened in these days? And Jesus, of course, knows, but he asks, what things? About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the prophets. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. So it almost sounds like they had this hope, but it was lost. Even though Jesus told them that you can still have this hope. I'm going to go to the cross. You can still have this hope. They didn't believe it. They didn't understand. And what is more, it's the third day since this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us they had seen a vision of angels who had said that he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. This is significant because when the Bible was written, women's words could not be thought of as truth. It's a tragic time. Women weren't even allowed to testify in court. But here it's stated that women found the tomb first. That's significant because if a Bible was written for people to simply believe, they wouldn't have included this. Because people would say, that's women telling that. Makes no sense. We can't believe that. But the Bible is written the way it happens. And I love that about this. Verse 25. He told them, how foolish are you? How slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things, then enter glory? So he's telling them again what he had said before. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what he said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Emmaus, Jesus continued on as if going further. But they urged him to strongly, stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over. So he went in with them. In verse 30, as we close this out. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, gave thanks for it, which Jesus often did. You hear about that in the Gospels all the time. And he began to give it to them. And when their eyes were opened, they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scripture to us? That burning heart thing, it's saying, truth is being spoken to me. When truth is spoken to you, oftentimes it hits you right here. Whether you agree with it at first or not, whether you understand it at first or not, it hits you right here and it won't let go. And that's what they're talking about. Hey, while he was talking to us, weren't our hearts burning? It's a wonderful story. It actually reminds me of a story I heard a long time ago that goes something like this. A man's traveling up the coast. He's walking along the sand, and as he looks back, he sees his own footprints. Along the way, he realizes that he's walking with Jesus, and he's having a conversation with Jesus. And they're talking about everything. Everything's great. But a storm rolls in, comes off the ocean, just overtakes the man. He tries to walk through it, but as the going gets tough, he gets exhausted. He ends up passing out. And he wakes up a little bit farther up the coast. And when he wakes up, his vision's kind of groggy, but he realizes something right away. There's only one set of footprints in the sand. And he thinks to himself, I must have collapsed here. And he looks over, and there's Jesus. He recognizes Jesus now, sitting at a fire cooking some breakfast. And he gets up and he walks over to Jesus and he says, why did you leave me when the storm came? I needed you then. And Jesus says, you're being foolish. When you passed out, I picked you up and carried you. Those aren't your footsteps. They're mine. And it reminds us, sometimes we forget that Jesus is with us and he walks with us. And we get angry with him because the going's tough. But Jesus is always there. And it's important that we don't forget that. We all take long walks to life's destinations, and we may even encounter storms along the way. And in the midst of our transition, we forget Jesus is with us. We remember beforehand when the times are good and we're hitting up church every Sunday and we love it and we love the songs and we love the communion and we love talking to people. When life gets tough, sometimes we forget Jesus is still there. And it's there that if we listen to his whisper, it's most clear. I think sometimes within transition is when we see that life is tough and I'm going to try to do this on my own. And maybe that rough time in your life is within your marriage, or maybe it's with a broken relationship, friend or family. Maybe it's your profession. Maybe you thought your career would be someplace else than it is right now, and you're in that rocky place, and you think to yourself, why isn't God here with me? Why isn't Jesus here with me? Maybe it's raising your kids. Raising kids is tough. I got 2 of them, and they're both great. But it is challenging. I love them to death. I'd die for them. But it's tough. And sometimes I cry out to God. And I think to myself, is it proper to cry out to God? John the Baptist did. King David did. Moses did. Even Jesus cried out to God sometimes. My hope is that we're less like these 2 guys on the road that don't realize Jesus is with us. But we realize that we walk down the road to Emmaus, that 7-mile journey, no matter how hard it is, that we realize Jesus is with me and I should acknowledge him. Because although that might not make this struggle go away, it's certainly going to help me through it. Because I know now the struggle is worth it. I know now the rough road is worth it. I know that stepping over these hard rocks is worth it. Because on the other side, God's got plans for me. He's going to use me. The reason you're walking down that road isn't because God doesn't have plans for you. It's because he does. And that's exciting. I want to share a second story with you guys. And it's all about Paul. And Paul was a guy who, we actually get introduced to Paul when he's witnessing the stoning of Stephen. Stephen was the first Christian martyr. And he was stoned by a bunch of people. And we hear that Paul was there approving of the stoning. Now, we think of Paul right now, we're like, well, isn't he the one that wrote a lot of the New Testament? Yes. But before that, he not only sat there for the stoning of Stephen, but he approved of it. And then after that, he actually asked if he could have permission to go persecute more people who believed what Stephen believed. So as we talk about Paul, who used to be called Saul, we talk about his first transition. And he's a man who knew transition. I mean, Paul, when he came to faith, he kept on traveling all around. He actually went on multiple missionary journeys all around Europe, walking from place to place. He knew what it was to walk that road. But as we hop onto his first transition, his conversion on the road to Damascus, we're going to see something special here. And I think it's going to hit all of us somewhere, no matter where we are in our faith walk. And it's Acts 9. And it starts off with this. Meanwhile, Paul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. This is the guy who wrote a third of the New Testament, and he starts out, his introduction to us is, he wants to murder believers. He went to the high priests and asked them for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, that's what they used to call Christians, followers of the way, whether men or women, he didn't care what gender they were. He said, I'm going to take them anyway. He might take them as prisoner to Jerusalem. Now, when you take someone as prisoner, if they die on the way, they die on the way. It's not that big of a deal. So that's his mindset right here. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, probably off a horse, and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? I look at this and think to myself, this is proof that Jesus walks the road with you. Never did Paul say, I want to go persecute Jesus. Never did he say, I want to find that leader of the way and take care of him. That's already been done, he thought. But Jesus felt that persecution. And he didn't say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute those people who were followers of the way? He said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Jesus is along the road with them. He's getting persecuted alongside these people, but Jesus is God. He's going to work through that persecution. And Saul, unlike the disciples on the road to Emmaus, knows exactly who's talking to him. Although he phrases it in a question, he says, who are you, Lord? I know you're Lord. Who are you? I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do. I think there's something about Jesus and roads. I truly do. I think that one of the most common places you'll encounter Jesus is on a road. And we see it over and over and over again in the Bible. Even when Jesus was on his earthly ministry, people approached Jesus in the road. He had encounters with people in the road. He healed the blind in the road. He had an encounter with a woman caught as an adulteress while he was in the road. Jesus encounters people on the road. So when you find yourself on a road, know that Jesus can encounter you there. Not only can, but probably will. So let's keep an eye out for it. And Jesus tells Paul immediately, hit the road. So Paul does. And on the road with Jesus, Paul writes more than a third of the New Testament. But while Paul's on the road, the New Testament didn't exist yet. The Gospels hadn't been written yet. He didn't have those to reference. All he knew was his relationship with Jesus and the Old Testament. And as he's walking with Jesus along the road, doing all kinds of crazy things, he connects Jesus to the scriptures he does know. He connects Jesus to Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Wherever your road takes you, Jesus is with you. God is with you. Paul knew that. Paul was a scholar of these Old Testament scriptures. And he recognized the connection between Jesus and Deuteronomy 31:8. It is the Lord who goes before you. Before you, on that road, he goes before you, and he will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Paul knew these things as he walked and started sharing who Jesus was, not with the people that he was most familiar with, but with the Gentiles, the people who weren't Jewish. He made a connection between Jesus and Isaiah 30:41. But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint. When that storm comes in off the ocean, you're walking up the coast, and you just don't think you can't, or you just don't think you can run or walk anymore, lean on God. Paul knew that. I'm sure he got tired walking literally thousands of miles through his life planting churches. And then Paul wrote a lot of the New Testament. You can see these writings and these interactions with Jesus pop up in his writings. Philippians chapter 4 has two of them. Verses 4 through 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind with Christ Jesus. And that leads into verse 19 that says, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in the glory of Christ Jesus. As you walk on your road, don't worry about anything. God will take care of it. As you go through the road and it gets tough, don't worry about anything. Lean on God. He's there. And Paul's saying this because he knows. He's been through it. If you're wondering what the title of this sermon is, it would be Hit the Road. Hit the road. Don't be shy of the road. Don't start and see that the journey's tough and turn away. Walk through the road. Hit the road. It's even embedded into our Compass motto. Beautiful feet are those who bring good news. That's our Compass motto. And beautiful feet travel along a road. No doubt about it. They walk along the road and they bring the good news. Hit the road. So I want to close with this. I want to say that it's inevitable to find ourselves on a road from here to there, wherever here is and wherever there is. But I want to leave you with 4 bits of advice that I've learned this past year as I've traveled a lot of roads myself. These aren't catch-all tips of advice, but they're aha moments that I've had through my past year. The first is, accept the fact that hitting the road is inevitable. Accept it. You've got to hit the road. A road's going to come up, and you can't stay where you are. You have to move. Not only does God want you on the road, but he wants to bless you on the road. He truly does. That doesn't mean you won't struggle. It doesn't mean you won't hit hard times, but you will be blessed. In the 2 stories we looked at today, the men hit the road for, I would say, probably the wrong reasons, but Jesus still encountered them. 2 disciples hit the road because they didn't think that Jesus was really the Messiah. Paul hit the road because he wanted to persecute Christians. Yet Jesus encountered them anyway. And I think what that means is, no matter where we are in our faith journey, whether we are still figuring out who Jesus is, whether we don't want anything to do with him, like Paul did. Paul didn't want anything to do with Jesus. Or we're walking our 50th year in Christianity and we're on that road still. Jesus can come to you on that road. He can help you on that road. So if there's a road sitting in front of you, hit it. Go. Go now. Well, wait a minute. Hold on. Let me go through over these next 3 ahas. But hit that road. Don't wait. Today, start on that road. The second is embrace the risk. Walking the road's risky. It's hard. No one's going to doubt that. You'd be a fool to say that walking on a road sometimes isn't risky, especially in times of the Bible. You didn't know if there were bandits on that road. You didn't know if you get attacked on that road. And if you're a Christian or a follower of the way, you can assume that adversity will come your way. But as you walk the road, know that Jesus will prompt you to do something that sounds crazy. Hey, a general rule of thumb, if it sounds crazy, it's probably from God. I mean, I told you earlier, my transition started because I gave my notice at a full-time job with great benefits where I was happy to pursue a calling I felt God calling me on that wasn't even a guarantee. Embrace the risk. It sounds otherworldly, but it's important. Hey, Jesus told Paul to get up, and Paul got up. And what really messed with Paul's mind, I imagine, is Paul, who is, the son of the Sanhedrin, the Jew of Jews. He is a person who is recognized and accepted and admired around the Jewish community. Jesus says to him, you're going to be the tool I use to reach non-Jews. And Paul must have been like, wait, I already have such a great connection with these Jews over here. Wouldn't I be a great tool over here? And Jesus says, no. Must have sounded crazy and absolutely ridiculous to Paul to say, go reach the Gentiles. Go reach the people who you wouldn't ever talk to. Embrace the risk. You can bet when you walk the road, you'll encounter risks. Embrace them. Number 3, expect adversity. Expect it. Even if you haven't read much of the Bible, you've probably heard about the adversity therein. I mean, those stories are the most popular in the Bible. The followers of Jesus, including Paul when he converted, and other disciples, experienced severe persecution. And although we probably won't see that level of adversity in our own lives, we will experience adversity. We'll see things that are tough to do. We'll get pushback. You want to share your faith in a difficult area. You feel God calling you to do it. Embrace the risk. Expect adversity. See, here's the thing, and I said this before, but the enemy won't bother you if you're not doing anything. The enemy won't bother, the devil won't bother you. He'll keep you comfortable. He'll keep you happy unless you start sharing who Jesus is with people. Unless you start sharing the gospel with people. Unless you start understanding this is good news and everybody needs to know this and start doing actions that show that, the devil will leave you alone. It's when you start showing who Jesus is to people that Satan will pop up and try to knock you down. Expect that adversity. Hey, this week I was sitting in an FCA meeting at Mountain View, and we had special guests, 2 actually. We had the Hollister brothers come in. They shared with our FCA group. Cody and Jacob came in. They play for, probably the greatest football team ever. I'm from Boston, kind of a Patriots fan. But they came in and they started talking about their journey. And what a great journey they've had. Not because they've been successful, because they faced adversity and they accepted risks. They embraced it. And what they talked about really was, we accept risks and we fought adversity so much that we didn't even have a plan B. We felt God calling us this way and we went. We just trusted God and we went with it. We faced adversity. That's pretty much what he said. He said, they both said, our plan A is following God. Now, for us, it took us to the NFL. I don't think that'll happen to most people in here. But for them, it took them to the NFL. And they said, there's adversity along the way. We expected it. We fought through it. I wasn't that wise when I was 24 years old. But at 40, I'm wise enough to hear good things from a 24-year-old. And I'm wise enough to listen to them and put it into action. So I'm gonna go ahead and expect adversity. I'm going to embrace the risks. And finally, 4, find the fuel to keep going, even if you've already reached your destination. When you're driving down a road, it's always a good idea to keep an eye on the gas gauge. You don't want to run out of gas in the middle of nowhere. And even when you reach your destination, it's always a good idea to fill up when you hit your destination. That way, if you have to leave unannounced or something comes up and you have to take off real quick, you don't have to stop at the gas station on your way out of town. That's also good advice for life. It's so important for us to dive into the Word every day. It's so important for us to look at the Bible and say, this is the way God communicates with us, through this and prayer. And this is different than a study time. A devotion is trying to get to know Jesus through His Word. A study time is trying to get to know about Jesus. And there's nothing wrong with that. You should be doing that. But don't replace getting to know Jesus with getting to know about Jesus, because getting to know Jesus has an effect on your life. Getting to know Jesus could potentially just be knowledge. Getting to know Jesus will help you love people when they're unlovable. Getting to know Jesus will allow you to display immense amounts of patience, just as Paul talks about with Timothy, with people who might not deserve it. Getting to know Jesus will allow you to forgive people even if they don't seek it. So whether you're a believer and you follow Jesus for 30 or more years, or you're someone still trying to figure out who this Jesus cat is, you're just sitting there and you're like, you know what? I came to church today, I'm just trying to figure out this whole Jesus thing. Is he worth following? Is there any truth to the stories I hear? The answer is yes, but you have to come to your own understanding of that truth. My call for you is to let's be beautiful feet and hit the road. Let's do what Compass calls us to do. Compass asks us. Compass' motto is to be beautiful feet. Well, to be beautiful feet, you've got to hit the road. So let's be beautiful feet and hit the road. Today when you leave here, hit the road for whatever that means for you. If that means transitioning from one place to the other, if that means that you've been thinking about one destination, whether you're going to go or not, and now you feel the call, you know what, I gotta hit the road. I gotta hit this. I know it's going to be a rough journey, but know this, Jesus is with you when he goes. I'm going to pray for us real quick. We're going to close with a little bit of, as we continue our worship, a little bit of music. God doesn't need our worship, but he deserves it. Let me pray for us. God, thanks so much.